Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm not here today, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to start by looking at the first part of Unit 4. So we just finished up Unit 3 with your presentations yesterday. So Unit 4 is about what we call economic indicators. So these things that we can look at to determine if the economy is a good economy right now or if we're having problems. So to think about it, if I ask you, just imagine I was there and I asked you, hey, how's the economy been doing over the past 5 years or so? Most people probably know, even if you don't know why you know, most people know the economy has been pretty bad. And so what we're going to see is that there's a number of things we can look at to confirm if the economy is good or if it's bad, if it's strong or weak or healthy or sick. So just like you might, if you feel sick, like if you feel sick and you think, oh, I have a fever, you might take a thermometer and check and be like, oh man, yeah, I got a fever of 102. I'm about to die. Like that thermometer, it measures how sick you are. So we've got things that we can use to measure how our economy is doing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is called GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. And that's what it says right here. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this. So when we talk about gross domestic product, what we're talking about is it's the value of all the stuff that we produce in our economy over the past year. So when you think about everything that was made in this country, that's every single hamburger sold at McDonald's, every new pair of shoes made by Nike, every car that was sold by Ford, everything that was made over the past year, how much it was all worth, we add that all up, and that's our GDP. So when we do that, it tells us if one year the GDP is, let's say, $16 trillion, and then the next year GDP is $18 trillion, well, that's usually a good sign because it means that businesses have started to produce more as time has gone by. And that means the economy is growing and people are probably buying a lot and people are getting jobs. That's all very, very good for an economy. Two random little details. This definition you see on the screen here is the total value of all final goods and services produced each year in an economy. This phrase final goods, what we mean by that is that a final good is a product that's been sold for the last time to its last user. So it's not going to be resold. So if you want an example, you could think of a hamburger at McDonald's. Now, that hamburger is being sold to you. It's not going to be sold to anybody else after you. It's done. So we're going to count that hamburger then, and it's going to be added to GDP. The opposite of a final good is what we call an intermediate good. An intermediate good is like the parts of a product. So for instance, for the hamburger, you need different ingredients. You need a bun and the meat and the cheese and the ketchup, and all those things get put together. But McDonald's had to pay for them to get them to bring them to the restaurant, and then they assemble them and then they sell the hamburger to you. So we only count that product when it's sold to you as a final good. The reason why we don't count it when it's still in its pieces as an intermediate good is because it would create what we call double counting, which is when we've taken the same thing and counted it multiple times. So we count that hamburger when it's sold to you, but if we also had counted it when it was in different parts, the bun and the cheese and the meat and the ketchup, we've counted essentially the same thing more than once. And that's going to give us inaccurate GDP numbers, which really isn't very helpful. So we only count the final goods. So question, what does GDP do? In other words, what do economists use it for? I kind of already mentioned this, but to review, we use GDP to measure what we call the size and strength of our economy, how healthy the economy is right now. And so you probably know maybe some of the most healthiest economies on the planet, some of the biggest economies. They are, as you'd expect, us. We are number one. China is in second place. Number three is Japan. Then we have Germany and then France. That rounds up the top five. After that, to get through the top 10, you've got England, Brazil, Russia, Italy, and India. And so we've got these big, powerful countries with big, powerful economies. And we see those economies, we can measure how large they are based on the GDP that we get, the value of all the stuff they produced. Here's another list. This data is from 2012, so it's a little old, I'm sorry. But you can see again, the GDP of our country in 2012 was $16 trillion. That's 16.2 trillion, not million. It's 16 million millions, which is a trillion. China at that time was around 8.2 trillion, and then you can see these other countries. The United States is the biggest in the world, but if you added up every country in the world GDP would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $72 trillion. That's a lot of stuff being produced on our planet in just 1 year. Now, here's the thing. When we measure GDP, we can't measure everything, or maybe we choose not to measure everything. So there's actually 6 categories of things that we don't keep track of, or we can't. The first is illegal stuff. When somebody, sells drugs on the street corner, or if, you make a copy of a movie and you sell it to your friend, that's a pirated movie, that's illegal. We don't count these things in GDP for a couple of reasons. Number one, we usually can't track it because most drug dealers aren't reporting how much money they earned, selling drugs. They're not reporting that to the government because then the government would come and catch them, obviously. Another reason is that we only want to count the things that signify our production in positive ways. We don't want to count the things and sort of have our GDP and the size of our economy advertised based on shady things that we're not very proud of. So illegal stuff is not counted. Second, we also don't count transactions of things where we just can't keep records of it. So these are legal things, but there are no records kept. So for instance, if you shoveled a neighbor's driveway and they paid you $10, that's great. That was something you did. The $10 technically maybe could be counted towards GDP, but you're not going to actually report that. You're just going to put it in your pocket and go spend it later. So there's no record kept of that. So we're not going to keep it tracked in GDP. Okay. Number 3 and 4, we also keep track of as much as we can, but there's still some things that are done in our economy that aren't like paid for, so to speak. So you might do work, you might, clean your house, or you might do your chores, your dad might mow the lawn or whatever. And even though these things are valuable, and maybe there could be businesses that complete them, when you're doing them without being paid for it, that's called a non-market good or a good non-market service. We don't count those things. That's just you doing, chores. So we don't count that stuff. I hope that makes sense. The 4th category has to do with used products. So if you buy an old PlayStation 4 on eBay, or your older brother or sister bought a used car, those products were counted in the GDP of the year when they were originally sold. And so we don't count them again if they're resold again. If we did, we'd be counting the same thing more than once. And again, that's double counting. We don't want to count that. We only want to count the things that were produced new for the past year. So used goods aren't counted in GDP when we see them bought and sold. Number 5 and number 6 here, we're almost done with this stuff. We also don't keep track of stock transactions. If someone is buying or selling stock, which remember is ownership in a corporation, that can be very expensive and very valuable, but they're not actually purchasing a product. Nobody had to actually have a business and produce that like a tangible thing. So because of that, GDP is not designed to measure that kind of thing, and so we don't count it. Number 6 is the last one. It's called government transfer payments. We don't count this. To explain what this is quickly, all you see is that, what on the slide at least, it talks about these things called Social Security payments. Social Security is money that people get from the government when they're old and they don't work anymore. They're retired. Well, while that's very generous of our government to give money, we see that that person isn't actually working to earn it. There's no service being provided that they're being paid for. So as a result, GDP is only designed to measure work that's done that got paid for doing a certain service. Well, this isn't actually doing that. It's just generous money to make sure that old people have enough to get by. So we don't count it in GDP. So those are the 6 things that are not included when we add up all the value of the stuff produced in our economy over the past 12 months or the past year. There's 1 or 2 more little things I do want to talk about, and it has to do with how we calculate GDP. To be honest with you, there's a pretty complicated method, some math, and all kinds of other details go into it. So I'm going to show you a very simplified explanation. All you got to do to calculate GDP in this simple way is you take the price of the goods or services you're talking about, and you multiply it times the quantity. So it's a little like calculating total revenue. And then you just take that number and you add it up to all the other products you did that for. So for instance, here's an example. It says if economy Z produces 3 kinds of goods, hats, clocks, and pens, and each hat is worth $3, clocks are $5, and pens are $1. And if we know that they made 10 hats, 3 clocks, and 10 pens, what is the GDP? Well, that's a lot of detail. All you need to do is think, okay, if they made $3 hats and then they turned around and sold 10 of them, well, $3 times 10, they made $30 just from selling hats. You can do the same thing with clocks. $5 times 3 clocks, that's $15 just from clocks, and then $1 for pens, and they sold 10, that's $10 for pens. So when you take the value, that $30, $15, and $10, and you add it up, the total value of all those 3 products was $55. And that would be the GDP of economy Z. That's how you calculate that, okay? Now again, in our country, we sell literally hundreds of millions of products every year, and those products, many of them cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So that's why when we look at our GDP, we're not talking double digits, we're talking like in the trillions and trillions of dollars. We've got a really large economy. Last topic that I do want to talk about, this is now kind of officially section 2, talks about these things we call business cycles. You're going to need to take your paper and probably flip it over. There's going to be a big empty box, and you need to draw something while I explain it. So this is what you need to draw. You want this to kind of fill the box on your paper. This is the business cycle. What it is it's a line, it's a wave. It goes up and down and up and down. And what it is representing is GDP. So as we move forward through time, from one month to the next month to the next month, GDP is constantly going up and then going down, meaning businesses are producing more and then they may be producing slightly less. And then they produce more again and then they produce less. So the way we see that represented is this wave. It goes up and then down and then up and then down. One complete business cycle is from one peak, which is this point where GDP has reached its highest point right before it starts to go down again. It's from one peak to the next peak, which is the exact same thing. So it's gone up and now it's going to go down again. From one peak to another, we go through a few other phases. First, down here at the bottom, this point is the lowest point that GDP is at for this current business cycle. It's called the trough. And between a peak and a trough, well, we have to see GDP going down. We say that GDP is contracting, so we call that the contraction phase. So when the economy is not very healthy, businesses start to produce less and less and less. After the trough, which is kind of like rock bottom, we start to see the economy start to recover again. So they start to produce more and more and more, and so we call this phase the recovery phase. Once we've seen GDP rise to match the previous peak level, which is what this horizontal line represents, see how it lines up with this peak? Once we've seen GDP get here, if it continues to go above that previous peak level, then we see the economy is actually expanding above and beyond what it was doing before this contraction started. So we call this phase the expansion phase. It's getting bigger than ever, which is great. Now, good things must usually come to an end, and once the expansion phase kind of stops, we'll hit another peak and we'll enter into another contraction, and this whole cycle repeats itself: trough, recovery, expansion, peak, contraction, trough, recovery, expansion, so on and so forth. One little detail is that we don't always get expansion phases. We might see we hit a trough, we start to recover a little while, but then we might peak again and contract again. It's no guarantee that the economy will ever always hit an expansion phase. Hopefully this was enough time to draw this and label the different parts. If you didn't draw this and label it, you're probably going to want to pause this video or maybe go back and make sure you get this down. There are 2 more terms, though, that relate to the business cycle and to how economies can be healthy or sick. The first is a recession. A recession is when you have 6 months of a contraction phase. So the official definition, it's a prolonged economic contraction. We have official time frames, usually 6 to 18 months, but as long as you hit 6 months in a row of contracting GDP, then by definition, you are in a recession. The most recent recession we had started in 2008, and it lasted for about a year and a half. It wasn't until around maybe late 2009 or early 2010 that we finally hit a trough and started to recover, and our economy is now even expanding beyond that. The other term is a depression. There's not a very clear time frame for how long the economy has to be contracting before we start to call it a depression. We just call it an especially long and severe recession. Other than that, there's no official rule for what a depression needs to be for it to be called a depression. We've really only had one in our nation's history, and of course, that was the Great Depression in the 1920s and 1930s, started in 1929. So, a depression is really bad. Unemployment gets really, really terrible. Businesses really start to produce a lot less. Most of them, if not all of them, have to fear about maybe even closing and just they die, and that's the result of a depression. So hey, that's it. I hope this was making sense. I hope it went pretty quick. You're hopefully again able to get down all the notes that we had. I know I'm not in class, but hopefully you was able to follow along. So now what you need to do is you need to go to the next step. So check Canvas, see what the next step is, and go ahead and do that. If you have any questions, shoot me an email or a message, and I will be back next time we have class. So long, everybody.